Hi, my name is Sophia, and today I will be going over the motivation of the U.S. Constitution, the way that it has evolved over time, and kind of its function in the United States itself. So to get a better understanding of the motivation behind the U.S. Constitution, we really have to take it back to the Articles of Confederation. More specifically, the Articles of Confederation were seen as the first U.S. Constitution, or at least one of the first governing documents in the United States. The Articles were originally adopted in 1781, and while it was seen as a step forward for Americans, there were also some issues and undeniable problems that arose and really needed to be addressed. One of the main issues that we saw with the Articles of Confederation was a weak central government. So essentially, the government in the U.S. could make laws, but due to the parameters of the Articles, there really was no way for them to actually enforce these laws. We also saw that at the time, the government did rely on funding from the 13 colonies or states, but again, there weren't the right parameters set up to actually get this funding, so oftentimes the government was underfunded and there was no system for taxation at this point. And then one of the third major issues we saw was that if any changes were desired or any type of reform was desired, it felt very unattainable because all 13 colonies or states had to agree to this change. So unfortunately at the time, what we were really left with was a country that was not only divided, but also pretty unstable. And this is what ultimately caused the founding fathers of the United States to want to develop a stronger, more balanced, and more reliable framework of how this country should actually be run. And with that, in the summer of 1787, we saw the drafting of the new Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. And as stated in Cohen's book, American Political Science, James Madison was the genius behind the United States Constitution. His fundamental idea was to design a system that takes human nature as it is and not what you want it to be. James Madison wanted to create an internal mechanism based on the idea that human nature will produce fair laws and public policy because of it and not despite it. And it's also important to note here that James Madison was not the only contributor to the Constitution. We also saw major role players like Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington. And in terms of the actual function of the U.S. Constitution, or what the founders really wanted to address, we know that according to a Britannica article focusing on the U.S. Constitution, that the framers were especially concerned with limiting power of government and securing the liberty of citizens. Thus, we see the emergence of principles and concepts within our Constitution like checks and balances, separation of powers, freedom, and federalism. And while we are touching on the motivation behind the Constitution, it is also important to mention that the Constitution has great significance in the sense that early colonists living in America had originally lived under a British monarchy, where they faced things such as taxation without representation, there were restrictions on trade, and overall the quality of life was just not the best. So ultimately this led colonists to kind of declare their own independence and seek somewhere where their freedoms and individual rights were respected and they felt like they weren't being exploited. So once the Constitution was actually developed, the story really didn't end there. We continued to evolve, and the Constitution's impacts have greatly changed over time. Something big that we see today is that the Constitution really gives our government its basic functions. For example, we can look at the executive office of the president. And as stated in the basic constitutional functions of government page in one of our modules, we see that Article 2 of the Constitution establishes the presidency and grants the president's executive powers. We can also look at Congress, in which Article 1 of the Constitution establishes the Congress, which includes the House of Representatives and the Senate. And then a slightly more in-depth example that we can look at as well is Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, as well as Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, which states that the Vice President serves as the President of the Senate and succeeds the President in case of death, resignation, or incapacity. In the world that we live in today, there are parts of the U.S. Constitution that are seemingly emphasized more so than others. One avenue we can look to is the protection of our individual rights. The Bill of Rights, for example, it is the first 10 amendments to our Constitution and ensures the U.S. citizens of things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, etc. And because of social media, these first 10 amendments have really become a hot topic in terms of, how far can you really stretch these and their purpose. So going back to the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, there's been a much deeper conversation in regards to actually owning guns and just the climate of owning a gun in America. And unfortunately, this is due to, a lot of the current events that have taken place. Unfortunately, we have seen a slew of gun violence in the past couple decades. Not that it hasn't existed before, but it's definitely been emphasized largely due to social media. And I think it's such a great, not great topic, but something that should be emphasized because you do have children that are being affected by this, families that are being affected by this greatly. And this isn't necessarily a conversation about if guns should be allowed, if they shouldn't, etc. But it definitely is a very current topic that is deeply rooted in the Constitution. And I think what's most important to mention here is that in terms of the Constitution's impact, it really outlines our response to things as a country and how the government will deal with certain things. For example, the Supreme Court, which is an integral part of the U.S. government, they have the power to determine the legality of certain policies. And these determinations that they make are also deeply rooted in the Constitution and the way that things have been defined. For example, before Roe v. Wade was overturned, it was seen as a constitutional right to have an abortion and make your own choices in terms of your reproductive rights. Once this was removed as a constitutional right, it became a fight for these reproductive rights from a state-to-state basis. And because people felt like their rights were being threatened, it became a huge topic nationally. And this is also something that became really emphasized in election campaigns. So, for example, entering into the 2024 election, we did really see a great emphasis on the topic of abortion and whether or not it should be an unquestionable right within the framework of the United States. That being said, we have also seen great steps forward due to the Constitution and what is outlined in the Constitution. For example, we can look to one of the best-known Supreme Court cases specifically, which is Brown versus the Board of Education. And this Supreme Court case ultimately ended segregation in schools, specifically for African American children at the time. And the Supreme Court essentially decided unanimously that this whole idea of separate but equal was extremely unconstitutional, and they were able to back this by using the Equal Protection Clause within the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And what Cohen's book, American Political Science, states is that the Equal Protection Clause states that no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So with that being said, I think it goes without saying that the founding fathers did not create or curate this perfect country, a perfect constitution, but they did give us a framework from which to work with over time. And what they were really trying to achieve was a healthy democracy in which, the power was in the people, laws were being enforced properly, leaders were being held accountable for their actions, one part of government wasn't overstepping in terms of the power that they were using, and also a constitution in which could evolve with the people and the times. Thank you.